name is Lucia Romano Ostrom. I'm a senior attorney at Disability Rights Texas, and Melanie asked me to come and speak to you all about service animals, and service animals especially in the realm of shelters, and for you all I'm imagining emergency shelters. So my goal today is hopefully not to confuse all of you, because there are many laws that can apply, and hopefully this will give you a little bit of a background as to what to expect and what laws would come into play. Okay, let's first talk about, in general, the Americans with Disabilities Act. It is, I'm sure some of you are familiar, a federal law prohibiting discrimination on the basis of disability in employment, government, public accommodations, commercial facilities, transportation, and telecommunications. And I have up there just kind of a summary of all the titles. Title I is the employment discrimination title. Title II prohibits discrimination by state and local governments. 3 is prohibits discrimination by public entities, and Title IV has to do with telecommunication entities. This law, yeah, I can't be too close to that, is that the issue? Okay, so it came into law in 1990, and it was amended in 2009. There were issues with problems with the law in the realm of what is a disability. A lot of court cases were being decided about typical things that we would all think are disabilities, and several cases have found, like, people who have missing limbs were found not to have a disability, so their cases were thrown out in court. So we had to go back and amend the law, so now under the law, it specifically lays out several conditions and disabilities that are disabilities, so that can no longer be disputed for cases that go to court. It kind of clarifies the issue of what is a disability. Okay, we're going to talk mostly about Title II and Title III, because those are the things that could potentially come into play when we're talking about shelters. In Title II, that prohibits state and local governments from discriminating against individuals with qualified disabilities in public accommodations. What that is courthouses, municipal buildings. If, for example, the city of Houston were to sponsor or have a shelter that's run by the city in some kind of emergency type situation, Title II would apply. Title III prohibits discrimination by public entities that are privately owned. So when we're thinking about, like, hospitals, physicians' offices, the Toyota Center, Reliant Arena, all of those things, that's where Title III comes into play. Hotels, and shelters. So, for example, if there's a shelter that's run by a nonprofit organization, Title III would end up applying there. Okay. Title II and Title III require that covered entities must be able to reasonably modify their policies, practices, and procedures that have the effect of discriminating against individuals with disabilities. For example, in a shelter, if there is in general, a no pets policy for an individual that has a service animal, that policy must be modified. The only way that they would not have to modify that policy is if it would fundamentally alter the service that they're providing, or if it would result in an undue burden. And by undue burden, they're talking more about financial undue burden, if for some reason it would put a financial hardship on the entity providing the service.
Can you give an example of that?
Of undue burden. I can't give an example when it comes to a service animal. If you're thinking about maybe like a nonprofit that is very limited in funds, and an individual comes in, and I can think about it in terms of, for example, interpreter services. If they can show that providing interpreter services for 5 days in a row would cost them too much money to sustain their business, then they would not technically have to do that. That doesn't mean that they don't have to provide any accommodations. That means that then they have to kind of think of other things that they could provide this person to accommodate them. It's kind of a flexible process. This comes up, I always like to, it comes up a lot in the employment arena under Title I. And all of these things are on a case-by-case basis. So for example, what Walmart can do for their employees, this is a very large corporation, obviously makes millions and millions of dollars, is very different than a small startup company with 20 employees. What is a financial undue burden for Walmart is very different than, a smaller entity. Okay? So under Title II and Title III, in general, service animals should be allowed to accompany the person with a disability in all areas where the members of the public are allowed to go. Exceptions to this rule is that if the animal is out of the control of the handler, if the animal is not housebroken, and if the animal poses a direct threat to the health or safety of others that can't be eliminated or reduced by an acceptable level by a reasonable modification to another policy. For example, we get a lot of issues of allergies. We have cases where an individual has a service animal and we work with the entity, and the entity is like, well, we have a concern because there are people with allergies or other conditions that may be negatively impacted by the presence of the service animal. So at that point, we have to think about what other policies can we modify so that both the person with the other condition, whether it's allergies or something else, and the person with the service animal can be accommodated. Okay.
Question.
Yes.
So what types of species qualify as service animals?
Yes, we are getting to that. And we'll talk about that, and I'll answer your question if it doesn't become clear later. We're going to talk about what exactly constitutes a service animal because it's different under different laws that I'm going to cover today. Okay? Okay. Another law that might come into play is Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act. This law applies to any housing program or any program in general that receives federal funding from the government. Section 504 includes emergency shelters and transitional housing programs that receive federal funds. So if, for example, FEMA gives a grant to an entity, a public entity or a private entity for having a shelter, 504 would come into play. Okay, the Fair Housing Act. When we're talking about shelters, the Fair Housing Act could also potentially be a law that would be an issue too for shelters. This act prohibits discrimination in housing on the basis of many things: sex, national origin, but also disability. A dwelling under this act is defined as any building or structure that is intended for the occupancy as a residence by one or more families. This covers multi family housing intended as a residence. And that's the key here. Both the ADA, Title II and Title III, as well as the Fair Housing Act, could come into play when we're talking about shelters. And it all depends on whether the shelter is intended as a residence, a residence for more than a few days or not. So it's important to know because the laws about service animals are different under the ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act, and the Fair Housing Act. I also included, although we're not going to talk about it much more, some of the state law and local laws that might apply to service animals and individuals with disabilities. And that includes the Chapter 121 of the Texas Human Resources Code, Texas Government Code, and also the newly passed HERO law, local ordinance. And another one that I did not put on here is the Texas Fair Housing Act, which basically kind of mirrors the federal Fair Housing Act. All right, this goes to your question. Well, let's talk about what is a service animal. Let's talk about the ADA first. A service animal means any dog, so it's specific to a dog, that is individually trained to work or perform tasks for the benefit of an individual with a disability, including physical, sensory, psychiatric, intellectual, or other mental disability. That's important to know. We get a lot of cases in my organization now, especially with veterans who have service animals for their mental health disability. And in general, there's not much. I think people are more familiar with service animals for maybe sensory type disabilities or even physical disabilities. So we're getting a lot of issues with people not understanding that a person with a mental health condition can also have a service animal. The work or task the service animal is trained to do has to be directly related to that person's disability. Dogs whose sole function is to provide emotional support, comfort, companionship is not a service animal under the ADA. And that's important. That's a relatively new change in the law because this is very different than the Fair Housing Act. The Fair Housing Act has a much broader definition of what a service animal is. 504. Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act does not clearly define what a service animal is, but the U.S. Housing and Urban Development applies a broader definition of an assistance animal when enforcing Section 504. Okay, the Fair Housing Act. Under the Fair Housing Act, a service animal is called or termed assistance animals. So you'll hear service animal, assistance animal as terms when describing animals who assist people with disabilities. They, like I had mentioned before, they include emotional support animals, which the ADA, as I mentioned, does not include that. And also under the Fair Housing, they do not have to be individually trained. Now, talking about the training issue, under the ADA, it does say that the animal has to be trained to do specific tasks to help the individual with a disability. That training doesn't have to be like from an outside entity. The person does not have to have like a certificate that says this animal or this dog has been trained. In fact, the person with the disability can train the dog to do the tasks it needs to do. But under the Fair Housing Act, we don't even need to go there. I mean, they can only be an emotional support animal. For example, we have a client who has mental health issues, and this assistance animal that she has just basically soothes her. It's a comfort animal, it reduces her anxiety, and that's an emotional support animal. Okay, so there's a 3-part test. What is an assistance animal under the Fair Housing Act? The person has to have a disability. The animal is necessary to afford the person with the disability an equal opportunity to use and enjoy the dwelling. There is an identifiable relationship or nexus between the disability and the assistance the animal provides. So there has to be some kind of connection, but certainly the Fair Housing is not as stringent or as narrow as the Americans with Disabilities Act. And again, why is this important? It's because shelters could be considered residences if the individual ends up staying there in an emergency for a very extended period of time. Okay, this comes up a lot too. What can you ask the individual about the alleged service animal? Say an individual comes in with a dog to a shelter, what are you allowed to say or ask about that animal? Under the ADA, the only things that you can ask is the animal required because of a disability? And what work does the animal do for you? The Fair Housing Act, again, is a little bit different. Housing providers may ask individuals to see documentation if the disability is not readily apparent or visible. The Fair Housing Act also, if the disability is readily apparent or known, but the disability-related need for the animal is not. For example, you're not entirely clear why this person has a service animal for a disability that you can tell the person has. The housing provider may ask the individual to provide documentation of the disability-related need for an assistance animal. What that means is, like, an entity can ask for, do you have a physician's letter, explaining the need for the service animal? What an entity can't do is, can you sign this release so I can get a copy of your entire medical record? Which happens. Okay. Let's talk about what is a disability. Again, under the ADA, it's been made pretty clear what a disability is. In fact, they list out a whole range of things that a disability can be. Under the Fair Housing Act is pretty much the same as the Americans with Disabilities Act. A person with a disability or handicap is used, the word handicap is used under the Fair Housing Act. They haven't updated that language yet, but it's an individual with a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activities, that has a record of such impairment and is regarded as having an impairment, or is regarded as having such an impairment. Okay. Last words of wisdom from me in putting this together. The preamble of the Department of Justice 2010 Title II and Title III regulations state that public entities or public accommodations that operate housing facilities may not use the ADA definition of a service animal as a justification for reducing their Fair Housing Act obligations. Go ahead. I've also included some links at the end of this that includes this official notice put out by HUD, the Department of Housing and Urban Development. It recommends that entities that may be covered under the ADA and FHA and potentially 504 first apply the ADA service animal test. If the animal is not covered under the ADA, then the entity should apply the Fair Housing, the broader definition of the service animal test. this would help all these entities from violating any possible laws that may come into play. And I've included some links there at the end and my contact information. So I'd like to just take questions if anyone has any questions.
Thank you, sir. Lucia, when they were initially developing these laws, they tried to define a list of animals that fit the criteria. One of them, I think, was a miniature horse. Do they still do that as far as the law goes? And do you have a list of those animals?
Yeah. Yes. So under the Americans with Disabilities Act, it's specific, it must be a dog. It's not species specific. There isn't, you know, if you have a pit bull can be a service animal. So there's no species that's, as far as dogs go, that's taken out. And actually, there are provisions under the ADA for a miniature horse. A miniature horse can be a service animal as well, but that's it. So the days of us having cases, you know, we've had monkeys and kangaroos, we've had pigs as service animals, those are gone. But the Fair Housing Act is open as far as animals. It's broader in that sense as well.
So are you saying that if individuals show up at a shelter and they have other animals other than the two that you said that they could have, that the shelter can turn them away?
Not necessarily, because if the individual, if that, I'm gonna get away from this thing, because the Fair Housing could come into play. The Fair Housing Act could come into play in that kind of situation, because it all depends on that individual's situation. If that individual is intending for the shelter to be a longer term residence, and I'm just thinking, like, you know, if we have a disaster like Katrina where people are displaced for a very long period of time, where shelters become, in essence, their home. It's their residence. I would think that at that point, the Fair Housing Act would be the law that you need to look to. And in that case, it's much broader definition of what a service animal is, what a service animal can do. So I think the advice from HUD to first look at the ADA and then look at the Fair Housing Act and see, is this individual going to be here for a long period of time? If that's the case, the Fair Housing Act would come into play.
I was curious about, you mentioned a long time. Is there a defined amount of time for that at all? There's not? Okay.
That's a really fact-intensive kind of question, and it's just a case-by-case situation. You know, courts look at the situation of the person, how long the person is there, the intent of that individual or family. Are they intending for that shelter or whatever other type of entity it is? If they're intending it to be a residence, and it falls under a residence under the Fair Housing Act, then it could be.
This might be a little bit off topic, so not related to service animals, but related to Section 508. What would be the messaging requirements to be compliant with Section 508? And I'm thinking of things that might be more graphic in nature.
I don't think I can answer that question. That's not a type of law that really I cover under 508. I can certainly look it up for you, and my contact information is in the back, and if you shoot me an email, and it'll remind me, and I can try and find that answer for you.
I didn't think I had a question, but in the case of an emergency responder arriving, is that a case where the service animal could or should go with them?
Could you tell me more, like what?
Well, let's say someone has called 911, or maybe a medical situation, they've called 911 for, they
Right.
need to go in an ambulance.
Yeah. So the situation is somebody with a service animal calls 911, they need emergency care, and an ambulance comes out to pick them up. Should the ambulance take the service animal? At that point, yes. I actually have a case where a similar type situation. My client has a seizure disorder, and an ambulance was called, and she has information on her about the service animal, and they still didn't take the service because they were saying the service animal wouldn't be allowed in the hospital, or because a dog shouldn't be allowed in the hospital. But actually, that's an accommodation that a hospital can do, and certainly the ambulance should take the service animal.
Jeff Floyd, City of Houston. I want to go back to the shelter question, because it sounds like there's a little bit of confusion about what the intent of the agency setting up the shelter is for, like how long they intend to keep the shelter open versus how long the person coming into that shelter with a service animal intends to be at that shelter. How do you reconcile that?
You can still use
Okay. Yeah, that's a good question. And I think you probably know more about shelters and how they're run. I don't know, if a shelter is established, if the city establishes a shelter and they specifically establish it as a short term, you're here 3 days and then you're out kind of thing, or do they have just an open policy, like we'll be open as long as you guys, or as long as it's needed for it to be open? I'm not sure how that runs, but maybe you can speak to that and might help answer that question for me.
So from my experience, and some of the OEM people can chime in, the shelters that we would open in emergency are not intended to be residences for, the idea is to try to, get people transitioned back into some kind of, more permanent housing as quickly as possible. But there are times, I guess, where, the definition of what is a few days, thinking back to when we, opened Ocean, we I think brought people into George O'Brien and then moved them to another shelter where they were there longer, but the intent was still to try to get them out to, transition them to some other kind of permanent housing. Not, so I think circumstances can have people there for more than a few days, but that was never the intent when that shelter opened up.
Right.
So how does the law apply there?
I think at that point you would have to look at the facts that you're providing, as well as the situation of this individual with the service animal. How is that person, is that person seeking housing? What is the likelihood of them leaving within a relatively short period of time? I think if a case like that would go to court, a judge would look at all of those facts and determine at that point whether this can be considered a residence or not. I think in general, emergency shelters would have a stronger case to say that Fair Housing Act does not apply. I think some of the cases when we're looking at shelters, we're thinking of maybe homeless shelters or domestic violence shelters, those kinds of things. But in general, to be on the safe side, you need to have that in mind.
I just want to go back to the question about the first responders and the service animals. taking them into the hospital. So you said earlier that there was 2 questions you could ask about service animals. Is this a service animal, and what does it provide? So if it provides something that the hospital is going to provide, I wouldn't take that animal to the hospital. Correct?
I don't think that just because the hospital is providing that kind of service that person would then, it would be okay to leave that service animal there. Like,
You're kind of opening up a major can of worms, trying to take service animals into ICUs or patient care areas. And when there's trained staff there that can provide that same service.
right. And I think that's a valid concern. And there's health concerns at that point as well. But at that point, when you're talking about health conditions, like in a place like a hospital, you have to think about, okay, well, can we take the service animal, but have the service animal be in another location in the hospital? Is the family coming with us? Are there other ways that we can accommodate this disability accommodation?
My scenario is if that patient is coding, what are you going to do with that animal?
Yeah.
Who takes care of that animal and who feeds that animal? Because if they're coding,
Right.
they're in the ICU for a number of days, is it the hospital's responsibility then to take care of this animal?
Right, yeah. No, I think that clearly under that situation, it would be a different ball game. I guess I'm not thinking of like this person is near death and coding and whatever, having heart attack and potentially is unconscious for a month. I mean, I'm not thinking of that kind of extreme.
I think that anytime they're coming into the hospital, they're reaching out now for medical care. You're calling 911, you're reaching out for medical care. That is above what that service animal can provide. And as Lisa said, who's going to care for that animal in this hospital? That is beyond a reasonable accommodation.
And depending on the situation, the hospital may have a good argument there. But, you know, sometimes we all know that ambulances are called for non-emergency type situations too, so.
While we have a few minutes, we have 5 or 10 minutes before our next presentation. I was going to let Sonia give us a little bit of a talk about 911.
Okay, I think Cedric, the people from Cedric have brought up a good point that we have to look at. And I think just to out decide, okay, I'm not taking the dog because the person is going to be in ICU or is going to be going to need emergency surgery, etc. I think they need to work with a couple of different agencies in town. We have BARC, and we can work with BARC to possibly have part of a policy where Cedric would contact, in this situation, they would contact BARC to take responsibility for the dog. I understand that it's a certain unique animal, it's a service animal, and just work out a policy here just to leave the animal behind, the dog guide behind, or the hearing dog behind, or service animal, a service dog of some type, is not a viable option because the dog is going to, ideally you hope there's family, but that's not always going to be the case. So I think that we need to work out some kind of policy that it can be put in place to assist the person. We, of course, never want anybody to be incapacitated, but it happens. So I think that as responders, we need to have some kind of policy in place for that. And I'd be happy to work with Cedric and several other agencies to work on that so that people don't get a lot of negative publicity that doesn't need to happen. Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Jay. Okay, so again, here's Sonia. She's going to talk about 911 quickly.
Quickly. If you've ever met me, I can speak quick, so hopefully you can understand it all. My name is Sonia Clausen. I'm with Greater Harris County 911, and I'm so pleased to have learned about this last week. We are doing so many things for your community that we hope are going to benefit more more of our public. One of them I want to let you know about, we announced last year about our emergency notification system. Many of our entities use it. It's available to all of the cities in and around Harrison-Fort Bend County. Many jurisdictions use another service. Some of them use this one as well. It's very easy for you to be contacted in the event of a localized emergency. And the reason we're letting folks know about it is because many of you do not have a landline phone anymore. More and more of our public are only using wireless phones, right? Well, up until last year, the only phones that could be contacted were those that were in the 911 database. We have some information at the back. All you need to do is go to the back, and all you need to do is go and sign up at 911.org, and your address, fill in your information about your address, your cell phone number, and even if you have what's called a VoIP phone number, an internet or a cable phone service. What's great about that now is that you can receive a call to a voice or a text message to your cell phone. So in the event there's a localized emergency, you can get a text message about the message. And those are anything from shelter in place, evacuation, missing persons, etc. But what's most important about it is it's for just the community that you live or work in, okay? It's not something you're going to necessarily hear about on the news to the whole Harrison-Fort Bend County area. The other thing, and the reason I asked that question about the service dog, a service animal, is that we are also implementing very soon another service where you can go on to 911.org and you can enter information about what we call your 911 profile. So in the event that you had an emergency, okay, that when the 911 operator answers the 911 call, on their screen, they will also have information about you or anyone that called from that phone number or that resident. So you could go into 911.org, you could list information about all of the residents and their profile. You could list their phone numbers, and then you could enter information about them. We're just now still developing it, so I would love to speak with anyone afterwards about any ideas you have, or feel free to email me some information. Some of our ideas that we have are, mobility issues, or do you have a wheelchair? Do you have some medical equipment, some oxygen tank? Are you deaf or hard of hearing? And as listening to it, I just learned, because should we add service animal? Do you have a service dog? That might be something valuable that the 911 call taker could relay to the responders. Okay, but most importantly, the reason I wanted to come and share this with you all is we are very soon going to be announcing to certain communities, and I want these to go to the right community first. I want the right public to know, and that's why I'm so happy to be here today, that we will soon be announcing true 911 text service. So what that means, well, first of all, how many of you thought that you could text 911? Okay, good. Because several folks assume, well, I can text you right now, so why can't I text 911? Well, it's just not that easy. You are living right now in the community that serves the largest 911 system in Texas, about the third or fourth in the country. And there are nearly 40 different 911 call centers in Harrison-Fort Bend County alone. So to simply text the number 911, a lot of magic has to happen and make sure that that text goes to the correct 911 answering point. And we're making that happen very, very soon for you. The FCC and the wireless carriers and the 911 industry have been working to make sure that the text to 911 service is available, not only for the general public, but mainly for one special community, and that is for the deaf and hard of hearing community. You might think, why would I want to text to 911? I wouldn't do it. I would not text to 911 if I could make a voice call to 911. But if my primary communication is to text because I cannot make a voice call, wouldn't that be a wonderful thing to happen? So we are working very hard to make that happen. There are a few communities in the country today that do have that service. They're not nearly as large as ours. The state of Vermont is one of them. They're proud to have all four of their 911 agencies, all four of their community, four wireless carriers providing that service. And we hope to do that very soon. And but what's most important is for you to help me educate the community that it's going to be for when you cannot make a voice call. So our slogan is call if you can, text if you can't. We will be announcing this to the deaf and hard of hearing community, and I do envision it'll be at the end of this summer. With 2 wireless carriers, we will have it available, and then we envision the rest of by the end of this year, we'll have all 4 major wireless carriers providing text to 911 service. Voice calls will always be the best and fastest way to reach 911. There are so many other operational issues that need to take place that would take place with a text call, that it would still be recommended to always use a voice call. But there's certain communities, and I bet you could think of another example. Anybody have another idea when it would be great if you're not deaf or hard of hearing? Come on, Malcolm, I know you got one. What about a home invasion? So that is my second example, and the audience I'll be communicating to is, what if there's a home invasion? Yes, sir? Domestic violence, perfect. So if you have any other ideas on how I can reach that community, I'll be targeting and hoping to reach those that serve the domestic abuse population as well, domestic violence. But also, we've thought of college students and others that are going to be in situations. Many of you have probably seen, and even right now, I do an annual public awareness campaign with the media. We do TV ads, radio, etc., billboards. I'm letting you know this one will not necessarily be this year on our radio and ad campaign. We want this to reach the primary audiences first, and so we'll slowly be doing, hopefully, a great outreach effort on this. So if you have any more questions or ideas for me, please see me afterwards. Thank you, Melanie.